When white opens the game with d4, black can decide to play in a solid, classical style with d5, taking a fair share of the center, gradually improving the position toward equality, and then seeking chances to play for a win if possible. The King's Indian defense, on the other hand, is a complex, sharp, and risky opening. Black is not trying to achieve equality, but prefers to create an imbalanced position, seeking fighting chances, often involving a sharp, kingside attack. We reach the King's Indian after the moves knight f6, developing a piece and controlling the center. White continues to take space with c4. A key characteristic of the King's Indian is a kingside fianchetto with g6. White continues to develop and centralizes a knight with knight c3. White is now prepared to take even more space in the center with e4. Black invites white to continue with this plan by playing bishop g7. Black's bishop develops to the long dark square diagonal, hoping to create active play on this diagonal. This move also prepares kingside castling. White continues to take space in the center with e4. White enjoys a large center when black typically plays d6. We have now reached the basic position of the King's Indian defense. White has 3 pawns in the center and enjoys a space advantage, controlling many of black's key squares on the 5th rank. Black accepts this space disadvantage to later counterstrike against white's center. Notice white's pawn on d4 can only be protected by pieces, as the neighboring c and e pawns have advanced to the 4th rank. Black has just played the move d6 to help support the center and prepare the thematic King's Indian pawn thrust e5. And in some variations, black also strikes in the center with c5. So these are 2 central pawn thrusts to keep in mind. Since black is not immediately putting pressure on the center, white has great flexibility in deciding how to continue. White's most common move is knight f3, developing another piece and supporting the center. Black typically continues by castling the king. Black's king finds shelter behind the fianchettoed structure and prepares to strike in the center with e5 or c5. White's most popular response is bishop e2, which looks like a passive move. It turns out that the bishop is misplaced if white plays bishop d3. This move does appear more active, but it blocks white's queen on the d-file, meaning white's knight on f3 is the only defender of the key d4 square. This invites black to play bishop g4, pinning white's knight, which makes d4 more vulnerable to attack, with moves such as knight c6 or knight f to d7, revealing the bishop's attack against d4. Since moving the bishop to d3 has serious drawbacks, this is why white typically prefers to play bishop e2, developing the bishop and preparing to castle without weakening the d4 square. Black now has 2 typical ways to strike in the center. Black can play c5, which can transpose into other opening defenses. Instead of c5, black can play the more common King's Indian pawn break, e5. Sometimes black prefers to prepare this move with knight bd7, which is a solid move, but thanks to a key tactical resource, the main line of the King's Indian is to strike in the center immediately with e5. On the surface, this move looks like it simply loses a pawn, but as we'll see, the hidden potential of black's dark-squared bishop prevents black from losing a pawn. After d takes e5, d takes e5, white usually trades queens with queen takes d8, rook takes d8. White should continue with bishop g5, pinning black's knight on f6. But if white tries to win a pawn with knight takes e5, white is in for a rude awakening with knight takes e4, regaining the pawn and discovering the dark-squared bishop's attack against white's knight. If white plays knight takes e4, black will simply play bishop takes e5, centralizing the bishop as the dark-squared bishop comes to life. If white tries to win a pawn with the desperado tactic, knight takes f7, hoping that black will play king takes f7, when white would then win material with knight takes e4, it's important for us to remember black's instructive resource, bishop takes c3 check. Instead of winning a pawn, white loses a piece after b takes c3, king takes f7. It's really important to review, as well as fully understand this line, as this is the tactical justification that allows black to play so aggressively in the main line of the King's Indian. Since black is not losing a pawn after the thematic e5 strike, White's most common response is castling the king. Black has several options in this position, including knight b to d7, as well as e takes d4, trying to open up the long dark square diagonal for black's bishop on g7, as well as opening up the e-file, preparing rook e8 to add pressure to the e4 pawn. Both of these ideas are reasonable, but black's most aggressive and double-edged move is the main line, knight c6. Black adds more pressure against white's center, especially the key d4 square. If white plays bishop e3, adding another defender to d4, black can play knight g4, attacking the bishop and revealing black's dark-squared bishop's pressure against the center, when black has created good fighting chances. White's main response is to take space and confront black's provocative play with d5. Now that the center is closed, black transfers the knight to the kingside with knight e7. The battle lines have been drawn. White has a space advantage and can prepare to fight for more space on the queenside with moves such as b4 and c5. Black can attack white's center with c6, a resource to keep in mind, but black's main idea is to move the knight away from f6 and begin a kingside attack with f5. We can see the clash of ideas, white attacking on the queenside and black committing to an all-or-nothing kingside attack after the moves knight e1, intending to centralize the knight with knight d3, which then prepares the thematic c5 pawn break. Moving the knight away from f3 also prepares the pawn move f3, building a pawn chain from g2 to d5 and strengthening the center. Black can play the move knight e8, but more commonly plays knight d7, preparing f5 and also adding protection to the c5 square. White has two main choices to consider. One option is to play bishop e3, developing a piece and preparing to help attack on the queenside. This move invites f5, when after f3, black can gain a tempo against white's dark-squared bishop with f4. When white's dark-squared bishop retreats to f2, both sides can expect razor-sharp play. Another option for white is to continue with the knight maneuver knight d3. White centralizes the knight and helps prepare c5. Black continues with the thematic King's Indian pawn break, f5. Black would like to see e takes f5, when this will help open up the dark-squared bishop with an eventual pawn push, e4. Instead, white can continue to calmly develop with bishop d2. The bishop avoids moving to e3, where it will simply be attacked by black's pawn. The main point behind this modest bishop move is to prepare rook c1. Let's watch how both sides continue to pursue their respective plans. White will attack on the queen side, and black will continue on the king side. After knight f6, black adds more pressure to the e4 pawn. So white reinforces the center with f3. Black can now grab more space on the king side with f4. And white can continue to grab space on the queen side with the thematic pawn break c5. Black's kingside pawn storm rushes forward with g5. It feels risky to advance pawns in front of the king, and black does need to be careful, but as the center is closed, it isn't so easy for white to exploit the weaknesses around black's king for the time being. White should continue to focus on invading black's queenside with rook c1. White's rook prepares to add pressure down the c-file, and black can now improve the position of the e7 knight with knight g6. Both of black's knights are now well positioned to help attack on the king side, and this knight may invade on the h4 square in the future. Black's bishop on c8 often watches the king side from a distance, and if black is able to force white's pawn to advance to h3, this piece may sacrifice itself on that square to help open lines against the enemy king. White doesn't waste any time and opens up the c-file with c takes d6, c takes d6. With this exchange, white has opened up the c-file and has also turned the d6 pawn into a backward pawn, so black's pieces will need to defend this weak target that white will attack. White can continue with knight b5, adding pressure to the backward d6 pawn, and prepares to invade black's territory with knight c7, attacking the rook and also eyeing the e6 square. Black can now combine attack and defense with rook f7, protecting the c7 square and also opening up the f8 square for the bishop. This helps protect the weak d6 pawn, and by vacating the g7 square, black's rook is now able to play rook g7, where it will help support black's kingside attack, especially after g4. After queen c2, white adds more pressure to the c-file, in the c7 square in particular. Black can play knight e8, defending c7, as well as d6, and can also consider to continue the attack with g4. The forcing queen b6 check, forking white's king and knight on b5, does not actually win a piece, as white can play knight f2, defending against the check and revealing the bishop's defense of the knight. Of course, both sides have several ways to play this complex position, but this at least gives us a sense of what both sides are trying to accomplish in the main lines of the King's Indian. Instead of knight e1, white can also grab space on the queen side immediately with b4. This is known as the bayonet attack, preparing white's typical pawn thrust c5. Black can respond with knight h5, preparing the thematic pawn break f5, and also eyeing the f4 square with the knight. Another idea is to disturb white's queenside plans with a5. Black attacks the bayonet pawn, trying to provoke white to advance with b5, when black can shut down the queenside with b6, eliminating white's play on the queenside, so black will have a free hand to attack on the kingside. One idea for white is to play b takes a5, but another strong move for white is to play bishop a3, protecting the b4 pawn and still preparing c5 with a complex position. In the main line of the King's Indian, both sides must be ready for a sharp middle game fight after white castles and allows knight c6. A more positional approach for white is to play d5, known as the Petrosian variation. White grabs space in the center and prevents knight c6. One drawback to this move is that the c5 square is no longer protected, so black can play knight a6, with the idea after white castles to attack the central e-pawn with knight c5. White can defend the center with queen c2, when white would love to force black's knight to retreat from its active post with b4, so black should play a5, when black has reasonable play to compensate for white's space advantage and central control. If white does not want to develop normally in castle kingside, allowing black's typical kingside attack, another interesting option is to play f3, known as the Zamish system. f3 supports the center, and after the typical move castle kingside, white can play bishop e3. We can now appreciate another aspect of f3. It prevents knight g4, disturbing white's dark-squared bishop. White may consider queen d2, preparing to castle queenside, when it actually may be black that has to face a kingside attack with moves such as g4 and h4, h5. Like most variations in the King's Indian, black can continue to strike in the center with e5, but another dynamic option is to play c5. When white moves the dark-squared bishop, c5 is often a thematic strike, as b2 is no longer protected, and black tries to open up the influence of the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. The move c5 also allows black to develop the queen, often with queen a5, or in some cases, queen b6 or queen c7. If white plays d5, then black will attack white's center with e6, and will also plan to attack white's pawn center with the flank attack a6, b5. We've actually transposed to another opening known as the Benoni defense, which is based upon attacking white's center with c5. Instead of playing d5, white can accept black's pawn sacrifice after d takes c5, d takes c5. Black's queen is ready to create some counterplay on the queen side with a move such as queen a5, so white typically trades queens with queen takes d8, rook takes d8, when white accepts the pawn sacrifice with bishop takes c5. White's bishop eyes the unprotected e7 pawn, so black continues to develop actively with knight c6. White is up a pawn, but black's dark-squared bishop will become incredibly strong on the long dark-squared diagonal once black's knight on f6 opens up this diagonal. Black enjoys a lead in development and active piece play to compensate for the pawn. Instead of focusing on playing e4 as quickly as possible, white has another positional option to consider with g3. In the fianchetto variation, Both sides develop in a similar fashion on the king side after the natural developing moves bishop g7, bishop g2, castles kingside. White can continue to develop and prepare castling with knight f3. Black now plays the standard King's Indian move, d6. As always, preparing to strike in the center with e5 or even c5. White's king evacuates the center with castling kingside. Notice that both sides have a symmetrical position on the king side, so it won't be as easy to launch direct kingside attacks like some of the other lines we've discussed. Black has many ways to play this position, but as you're learning the King's Indian defense, one common setup you can use in most variations is knight b to d7. When in doubt, you can almost always play knight b to d7, followed by e5. Typical play can continue with knight c3, e5. White can now grab space in the center with e4. When after e takes d4, knight takes d4, Black can play rook e8, adding more pressure against the e4 pawn and preparing knight c5, which is an important resource to remember if you capture White's pawn on d4. White will enjoy a space advantage, but Black will have reasonable pressure against White's center, offering a strategically rich game with chances for both sides. So far, White has been satisfied with maintaining a solid space advantage, but what if White wants to punish Black for not directly occupying the center? White would like to play e5, but Black's pawn on d6 is ready to play d takes e5. When after d takes e5, Black is simply able to trade queens when the pawn on e5 will prove overextended. If White wants to try and punish Black with an early e5, then White can employ the four pawns attack with f4. White has a serious space advantage, but Black does not have to fear the four pawns attack as long as Black remembers to energetically counterstrike in the center. Black can play c5 immediately, or else calmly castle the king. If White plays knight f3, adding more control to e5, Black can strike against the center immediately with c5, adding pressure against White's d4 pawn and preparing the aggressive queen move, queen a5, creating more pressure against White's position. If White tries to immediately grab space with e5, Black's knight can now enjoy the retreat square vacated by Black's king, allowing knight e8, moving the knight to safety and revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure on the long diagonal. After knight f3, Black can play knight d7, adding more pressure against the e5 pawn and preparing c5. But Black can also play the instructive pawn sacrifice, c5. Black has added serious pressure to White's pawns on e5 and d4, both on the long dark-squared diagonal. Once again, we see Black trying to activate the dark-squared bishop. Black is ready to destroy White's center with c takes d4, and after d takes c5, knight c6. Black is ready to regain material, so after White plays c takes d6 and e takes d6, Black has sacrificed a pawn, but has tremendous pressure against White's e5 pawn. If White captures the d6 pawn, then Black's bishop will become incredibly active on the long dark-squared diagonal, when Black's active pieces and queenside pressure will more than compensate for a pawn. This is why the four pawns attack isn't so popular, as White cannot roll over Black in this variation. The King's Indian defense is one of the most uncompromising, double-edged responses to d4. White is allowed to build up a strong center when Black is ready to strike back with e5, or in some cases, c5. If you are not overly concerned about reaching an equal position as Black, and are willing to accept positional risks in order to create sharp, at times chaotic play, then the King's Indian defense may be for you. Thanks for exploring the King's Indian defense, and best of luck navigating these exciting, complex waters if you choose to play either side of the King's Indian defense.